You will find an option for simultaneous interpretation for this webinar. On the bottom toolbar, you're going to see an option that says interpretation, and you can choose the language of your preference to hear. Thank you, Camila, and warm regards to all of you who are joining us today and sharing the launch of the results of the WHA project, the evaluation of the certificates for pharmaceutical product for processes of medication registration in the Americas towards more timely access of medications and a regulatory focus. With satisfaction, we share the report in its first phase, destined to classify the regulatory requirements and practices with the use of CPP in our countries for the registration process. The execution of projects like this one is defined by the network supporting the harmonization processes for the Americas. And they've always been decisive in deciding for a regulation that is strengthened and more efficient and has changed significantly the world context. Globalization and evolution of the pharmaceutical industry, together with the speed of research, the number of pharmaceuticals in different phases of development, and taken in such diverse places, represent a challenge for the regulation in the region of the Americas, which requires harmonized and transparent processes. In this scenario, regulation is an indispensable tool for the consolidation of international trade. And therefore, it is essential as well that the development policy and foreign trade and the regulations applicable to products and services for health are in line with the practices recommended internationally, making it easier to recognize and accept. We want to express our satisfaction for the way in which this project has taken place between SecMed and FIPHARMA, which we see as a satisfactory experience in joint efforts between the industry and the regulatory authorities as a function of conducting actions that converge in the same result. And this strengthens the integration of the regulator with the regulated sector through the creation of strategies to continue working towards rapid access to medications and technologies from the research, investigation, and development phases of the products. These models have to be optimized to the benefit of all the parties to have an entry process into the market of new products. We give very important thanks to all the regulatory authorities, the associations, and manufacturers who have contributed to the success of this work as a total cooperation with a magnificent working environment, as well as joint collaboration, which is open, and the facility to work that has been provided by the industry, and particularly for the preparation of this webinar we're having today to launch the product. Based on the experience of this initiative, we see its continuity for a second phase, with conviction that everything will end in an efficient performance to achieve the well-being and protection of the health of our population. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Jacqueline, por sus amables
Thank you,
palabras.
Jacqueline, for your kind words.
The floor to Juan Carlos Trujillo, International Policy and Operations Director of PhilPharma, and Juan Carlos will act as the host for the rest of this webinar. Juan Carlos, you have the floor.
Camila, thank you very much. I am very pleased on behalf of PhilPharma to take part in this milestone. PhilPharma, for those of you who don't know us, is the Latin American Federation of the Pharmaceutical Industry, which has been around for quite some time, since 1962, and holds official relations as a non-state actor with the Pan American Health Organization. At the moment, we have 14 multinational R&D pharmaceutical companies as members, as well as 11 local associations from countries in all of Latin America. One of our main goals is to provide us support on behalf of the pharmaceutical R&D industry to all of the policies that can impact and benefit the health of patients across all the region. And to do this, we have several lines of work. One of them is a close collaboration with the PANDRH, which is the Pan American Network for Drug Regulatory Harmonization, within which we have developed this project that we are very, very proud to present today. The project has been done together with SECMED, as Dr. Jacqueline just mentioned, and it has been an extremely fruitful experience for us. We really want to thank the activities, the work that SECMED has been doing, led by Dr. Celeste Sanchez, and also on behalf of PhilPharma, the participation and leadership of Camila Gomez, whom you just heard of, and our co-chairs, Rebecca Lumsten and Lorena Mauro. It is an extremely important part of the activities that we're doing right now. I hope that it will be as useful as it has been conceived. And for that, we will be very, very interested in having the feedback from all of the participants in today's webinar. So having said that, we can go to the next part of the agenda. As Camila mentioned at the beginning, we will have some highlights of the mapping report. I will invite Dr. Celeste Sanchez, who is the head of the Division of Policies and Regulatory Affairs in SECMED, to provide this highlighting. I do want to remind all of the participants in the webinar that you are able to include your questions in the chat at any time, and we will have them in consideration to be replied during the question and answers part of the webinar. If for any reason we are not able to answer all of the questions that we receive, we will do so on a written form in the course of next week. So having said that, please, Dr. Celeste Sanchez, the floor is yours. And thank you once again for your great leadership in this project.
Muy buenas para todos. Es un placer para mí.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to introduce, on behalf of the coordination of the project by SECMED and PhilPharma, the results of the first part of the work. So we're going to highlight a summary of all of the elements that have set the trends already identified in our work and research to identify the practices and regulations in the area regarding the use of the pharmaceutical product certificate of the WHO by our regulatory agencies. Alejandra, please. So this project is titled, as we all know, the assessment of the requirements for the certificate for pharmaceutical products for processes of registration of medications in the Americas regions towards a more timely access of medication and more convergent regulatory focus. So, as those who preceded me said, this is a project of the PARF network of the World Health Organization. Alejandra. The structure of the certification for quality of the pharmaceutical products that are subject to international trade, which of which the main player and the most well-known player is the pharmaceutical certification product or product certification, was approved in the year 1969. And it's worth highlighting that this was done from a proposal formulated by the organization. There's been updates in 1975, 88, 92, and the latest one was approved by the WHO in its General Assembly after some time in 1997. We still have not included in the next assembly this topic, but it should be produced soon for the general approval of the latest update. Alejandro, please. So, while the latest update published and in force since the year 1997, this doesn't mean that multiple actions have not been taken to update the structure. And again, the prevailing role of CPF or CPP in English, as we have denominated this key certificate of this scheme, and it's had multiple actions for updates while it still doesn't have its latest version published completely. The topic has been discussed in several meetings, but the experts committee for pharmaceutical preparations of the WHO, and they've agreed on identifying the need to progress. Now, as a temporary measure, they have published two versions of questions and answers in the interim of the updates. And as of 2018, this was open to public consultation, the different modifications, and there's been a whole process since 2018 to 2020, where recently, in the month of October and during the 55 or 55th meeting of the Pharmaceutical Committee of WHO, the cycle has been closed for consultation to have an updated structure. Of course, there, if anything has been modified through time, it is precisely the characteristics of international trade and for medications, globalization, the acceleration of the development of new products that give an answer to the scourges of mankind. And recently, as we all know, we're still submerged in the pandemic of COVID-19, which implies that we will need skillful and clever ways to move these pharmaceutical products in the world. Our region, of course, is a big part of this context. And from here, Alejandra, from here, this has the approval of a project that was also submitted by the industry. We have to highlight this project. This is done from the proposal done by PharmaCeuticals, So it has two main goals. Basically, the first one is the characterization, the diagnosis, mapping of the regulatory requirements and practices to use CPP in our countries. Of course, within the registration processes. So we are here trying to identify trends and to say which way our region is going. And in the project phase, we are finalizing happily the launching of the executive report and the full report. From that point on, our project contemplated a second phase to implement the findings that are made in the diagnosis such that they translate into a specific benefit, and that we don't have just something academic as a result, but that we can incorporate into the practice from the improvement opportunities how to actually achieve to facilitate access in timely manner to the medications from the more convergent regulatory focus and better understanding of analysis and communication in our region. So this project was approved, and at the end of 2017. In 2018, we did a survey and we applied it, and we plan to have authorization by the regulatory authorities. And in 2019 and 2020, we have been analyzing the results and providing the report that we submit to your consideration today.
Esta encuesta que les he mencionado
This survey that has been mentioned was designed starting from the elements that were already known and the questions and answers, the previous work done, and the previous work done by the industry, of course, in the year or at the end of 2017, almost coinciding with the approval date of our project. The survey has 10 sessions, 58 products, 58 questions rather, she corrects herself, where we are including the most important elements that could give us an adequate guide as to how the region is working in the Americas on this pharmaceutical product certification. So these discuss the request for registration, characteristics of innovation, and how the CPP that is requested, if it is evaluated by the authorities and how it is, and the concept of the country of origin, considering that at the beginning of this structure, this was very clear, but as of the incorporation of a sequence, an elevated sequence, where we are working to prepare the same product, the concept of country of origin does not have that connotation that it had 20 or 30 years ago. We also had a session focused on what happens when you cancel or you have a record in your country that approved the product, in the country that issued that certificate. So in section 9, we've incorporated a set of elements in organization and logistics that were also known, and they had suffered transformations through time and had a severe impact on the possibilities of making our system more convergent. One was training and how everything is prepared. The CPP, the electronic CPP, is something that is already being more popular, more frequent, and something that implies legal or excessive legalization and the formalities to take place for the CPP to actually be incorporated, the validity of the certificates, if they are issued for a short time, they will not give way to the full process or dynamic implied by this evaluation. At the end, it's already expired. So this is also the existence of requirements, and in the biotechnological industry, there is a very rapid pace, and perhaps if the region had this trend, then there would be some specific requirements. So this is in regard to the synthesis. Now, lastly, for the authorities in CPF, we have found out what relationship existed between what we were asking for in the region, and this is something that we were informing in another CPP. We had a full participation in the entire region of the Americas that were present in this survey. Sometimes the industry, sometimes the authority, and the industry and the authority. So in these factors, everyone had the possibility to participate and respond and ask and convey their opinions to be analyzed by the work team. We had 27 countries, 24 authorities, 8 pharmaceutical associations, and 2 pharmaceutical ones. And in the region, we had the participation of the 8 regulatory authorities of reference of the Americas and the Initiative for Harmonization in Central America, which is important because from the legal standpoint, it has a common regulation. So it has an approved instrument that generates the convergence in the region, and it includes the mandatory nature of the certificate. So as a reference, the authority has a system in the regulatory system, and all of them took place or participated. Alejandra? Here we have an element that is also identified. It is in the column on my left. So the 8 reference authorities of the region that were evaluated as the maximum level of performance with the tool of the Pan American Health Organization throughout the entire process with the authorities. And an important characteristic that frames this region is that they have 2 reference authorities that are recognized among the demanding authorities according to the concept that has been handled for a long time, that does not use its certificate in its processes. So these are authorities that allow that CPF but do not use it in the process. So this is something that frames the or sets the pace in the fact that 25 countries are using CPP protected under the national legislation. And that means that this is a practice that is very instilled in the region and contemplated in the legal instruments where our authorities work. Next, please. In the first section, we talked about asking some questions about the requests and what are the relevant elements that we want to share. First, what is left or missing from the CPP. And this is issued by the authority of the country of reference. And each one of the words that you're going to see here in this slide says about or talks about the country of origin. It doesn't have to be a country of high surveillance. The concept of the country of origin that we've talked about has development and a variation. And for this region, the concept of the country of origin is the country where the place of manufacturing is located for the finished product. The previous registration is mandatory, and you have to declare it in the CPP, but it does not have to be registered in the country of origin, but rather it has to be registered, as the survey says, by the country of where it's coming from. So it doesn't mean that it's the country of origin. It's basically the country where it came from. That's the country that has to be registered. So in consequence, it is accepted that it is issued by an authority, and even though it's not the country of origin. So it is also accepted in this certificate, which has been granted by this country, and it is based on the intention for best manufacturing practices and has been done by other authorities. As you can see, we have already an element of the history of what has been left behind, but we also have good seeds to optimize certain practices because the registration is accepted even though it's not the country of origin, and we also accept that it is issued as a function of best practice inspections. Alejandro? Very well. So to continue talking about registration, we admit the replacement of this CPP for any other document. Now, it is asked to make this presentation together with the initial request, together with the initial file, all at the same time. And this is how it works in the region. Now, we have to explain that notwithstanding the fact that it is requested from the beginning, it does not bring as a consequence the reduction of the information or the simplification of the file, and it does not imply any agile means or ways or the evaluation, a full evaluation, and in many cases, and not because of the CPF, but it only refers to products that have been approved by authorities that are demanding or authorities of reference in the region. Maria Alejandra, please. In the case of renewals, for the renewals, when there's a renewal, when it exists, it has to have the same requirements. Now, although it doesn't have to be in with the same authority, you have to give information on the status. For changes or modifications, it's the same story. You request the same certificate of the pharmaceutical product that was requested by the registration, although we ask that it is issued by the same authority that issued that benefit. Maria Alejandra. Very well. The certificate of pharmaceutical product has to have the state of commercialization of the product. They have to declare the registration of the country that granted it. The diluent has to be included as well. And in general, all of the seals involved in the manufacturing in the different phases of the product have to be listed in the label. However, in this document, you do not have to attach information for the patient or for health professionals. Next, please. All of the authorities perform the assessment, and as we mentioned before, almost always they are supported by the national regulation. All the CPF information is considered relevant. There is no distinction in the assessment for what is being asked or the time of the trade or commercialization. And it recognizes the certification of best manufacturing practices of the product when it is declared in the CPP. In this case, it is not. But while it's true that this is a certification that is accepted, you also have to say that in most cases, in addition to the CPP, they request a best manufacturing practice certificate. On the next section, we have the previous record which is requested, and there is evidence that it is assessed, and this, since we found these different practices, of course, we have to, or we have a long way to go to try and reach a point of convergence, because on the assessment of how the authority does it, we had the trend or inconsistencies in the answers and difficulties to identify actual trends. There was a lot of opportunity to improve there. And in the next section, Maria Alejandra, next, we have that what is requested to the country that is suspending or canceling the registration is to report to the authorities, and report to the authorities, meaning that this will have an impact not just as an automatic cancellation, but it will consider for the renewal and for the adjustment of the information or some parts of it. In the case of the state of commercialization, it does not require commercialization per se, or for request, or for renewals and for modifications. And so, and they don't ask for anything specific to regarding the time of commercialization.
Bien, en general, aunque ese elemento
And
no
if
es
this element, although it's not mandatory in general, when it is declared in the state of the commercialization, if it is active, it does not consider what time the product has been in the market. So this means that this is another point that will also require some work, because the focus of the authorities has certain differences, and sometimes we could say that they are inconsistencies. In section 9, Maria Alejandra, in section 9, we have that there is missing the training of some people. The authorities have stated that they require more training because some have done it, some have not. Now, the electronic CPF is not a concept that exists in the regulatory, in the national regulation. It is few of them who accept it, and they request the legalization and translation and the time that is taken with the issuance of the certificate.
no es suficientemente aprovechado por los requisitos de legalización y
Here we have the
traducción.
requirements for legalization, and the legalization, we insist that it's a practice that is generalized, and it is legislated in many countries, and therefore, to make it more flexible and faster, or eliminate it, it will be very difficult in this area. The requests are accepted at the time of registration by the legal representative, and there are deadlines for the validity of acceptance, and there is no specific requirement to get this product. Now, in the last of our sessions, which was applied, as we said, for those countries or those authorities that issue the CPP, there are specific deadlines. Now, normally, between 5 and 20 days is the time it takes to issue a certificate to our authorities. There's exceptions, but this period is relatively logical. And in some cases, the 20-day frame is established by law. Now, it is not a regional practice, nor the acceptance, as we said, or the issuance of the pharmaceutical certificate or electronic certificate, but there is a term for the certificates that are issued for validity between 1 and 2 years. And when we compare these certificates to the model of the WHO, we arrived at the conclusion that there is high compliance with what was established in the organization. So, lastly, we want to point out some of the elements that give strategic value to the work that we've done and decreed, and it is these. In phase 1, we are concluding at this time that we could be proud, I think. We have to say this because we are very satisfied to having reached this point with a characterization of the practices in the region for the CPF. So it is of high value to go to the next step, which is the perfecting of the specific regulatory systems, as we had anticipated to have a process of the authorities worldwide and regional. Now, we are satisfied to have achieved this being the fruit of the work between the industry and the authorities, because this contributes an additional value in everything that we have left to do or what we wish to do. So unquestionably, we have different standpoints in our questions and the appreciation of the industry or the opinion of the industry and the authorities. So this is part of the wealth of the elements that we have achieved. Now, this study is not the only one that has taken place. We had already given the reference. So even there's other studies, for example, done where they've taken into consideration some countries, and this is the one with the biggest scope. And it is important from our perception to have some progress in these new opportunities for improvement. So many of these aspects have a logistic standpoint and repercussions, and it is that the project was developed coincidentally with the consultation and approval of the WHO of the latest and last modernization of the structure of the scheme. So this element gives us, as a region, an opportunity, an important opportunity to analyze and to update the work in the region with the difficulties well identified and with what we have in the new information or the new focus of this updated scheme. And it is enriched throughout the development of the project, and it shows the importance of the impact. And lastly, Maria Alejandra, our premise, our commitment in the health of our people. And we are working to reach these goals and apply the advantages of science and the use of these scientific findings for more convergent regulatory models. And don't forget, always focused on access of the medications, the quality, safety, and acceptance. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Celeste, for your magnificent presentation. I think that it was a very good illustration of the wonderful work that we have done so far. So we are very, very grateful. At this moment, we would like to begin the part of the meeting where we will have some comments from our panel of experts. Each one of our panelists will have 5 minutes. We are very lucky indeed to have an excellent panel of experts. We have Dr. Sabine Kopp, who is the team lead for norms and standards for pharmaceuticals of the World Health Organization. Dr. Samuel Azatian, the team lead for regulatory convergence and networks of the World Health Organization. Dr. Lawrence Liberty, head of regulatory collaborations in the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science, CIRS. Dr. Rebecca Lumsden, who is the chair of the Regulatory and Biologics Working Group in PhRMA. Each one of them will have 5 minutes for comments, and after their comments, we will have a Q&A session where we will also be joined by Dr. Mario Alanes, a senior consultant in the CIRS, and Dr. Celeste Sanchez, who you just heard the presentation from. So please do bear in mind that you can have the possibility of asking any question within the chat option at any time. And at this moment, I would like to invite Dr. Kopp to share your comments for 5 minutes. Dr. Kopp, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Buenos dias, muchas gracias. Thank you for this invitation to an important milestone meeting. And I can only but concur with Dr. Celeste Sanchez that this is really a very impressive work that you have been carrying out under the PANDRH. Of course, there are global links, and she has already provided you with some data on the certification scheme itself. It is in operation since '69 and was amended 4 times already until the last version that is currently in use in 1997. WHO has been notified as similar to what you have seen in the survey of various challenges with the operation of the scheme, because it has been a few years ago that it was passing through the World Health Assembly. We had various meetings trying to take care of the questions and challenges that have been raised, and we have also issued the question and answers as has been exposed. In 2017, we have started to send out a proposal for revision of the scheme in order to respond to all these queries, questions, and issues that were raised within the trends in the world nowadays. The working document was then sent out again in 2019, and we have received about 200 comments from 20 entities. We have compiled all the comments and also a list of related authorities that were interested to work with WHO in order to address these comments and also, more importantly, share their experience with using the scheme. We had 14 national regulatory authorities who participated in this exercise in August this year, including China, Cuba, EMEA, the European Medicines Agency, Ethiopia, Ghana, Indonesia, India, Japan, Kenya, South Africa, Tanzania, Thailand, USA, and Zimbabwe. We invited a few more, including, for instance, Brazil, but they were unfortunately not able to attend. It's probably also good to mention here that these representatives were not only working with the certificates, but some of them are actually heads of agencies, just to show how important the CPP is taken around the world. We would like to express a very special thank you to Dr. Celeste Sanchez, who has assisted us in the preparation of this last meeting in October. She has prepared a comprehensive overview of the suggested amendments and also helped us how best to address this feedback, because obviously not everything is aligned. And so we had a very good support from the region, with also the knowledge of the outcome of these studies already that you have undertaken and presented here. When we had the meeting, as mentioned before, we addressed each of the comments, but also each of the practical experiences and challenges that were raised by the authorities that participated. In October, the scheme was then presented to the 55th Expert Committee. And the major changes in the scheme that came out of the August meeting were including, for instance, that the regional organizations should also be able to be accommodated in the scheme, that the member states should report updates of their names and addresses of the authorities, that the member states should also declare that the competent authority meets the requirements that are set out by the scheme and report back and notify to the Director General that they comply. Then also we have a model notification that has been annexed as new Annex 2 to the document, informing the Director General of WHO. So there's a model that will be included. We also have, very importantly, the inclusion of provision that the CPP will facilitate reliance among the participating authorities, and this will enable a timely access to medicines. There is a modernization in the way that you can also now email addresses, telephone and website address in the scheme, and a standard time frame with ideally between 20 and 30 working days was added. In addition, it was added that legalization should not be requested, and the statement of marketing authorization was actually removed to simplify the scheme. There's also the change in the model template so that the proposed trade name in the importing country can be stated. These are some of the main changes that were addressed in the August meeting. And in addition, in October, the expert committee members, they have added some further revisions in acknowledging that there are different types and pathways for marketing authorizations. And also they wanted to include the product marketing authorization webpage if it is available. In addition, with regard to the GMP compliance, there is now an option rather than an obligation for the location. And also the GMP for assuring the quality of APIs has been removed. Altogether, the expert committee was highly recommending that there should be a shift to use electronic systems in the future. And also the certifying authorities are encouraged to ensure that they have the competence and capacity to implement the scheme. And this has been done by adding a reference to the WHO global benchmarking tool. Altogether, the expert committee noticed that once the revised guides are adopted, which they did, and also available for use, a number of implementation and operating issues might have to be addressed in the future. So this is very briefly the outcome of the revision process, and we are currently in the editing stage so that the new version of the scheme can be made available to the member states as an annex of this expert committee meeting. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a good, successful meeting for the rest.
Thank you very much for your comments, Dr. Kopp. Highly appreciated. We want to invite now Dr. Azatian to share his perceptions on the impact of the results of the report that we just heard, and your views on how modernizing the practices and the use of the CPP might be linked to strengthening the regulatory systems globally and of course in our region. Please, Dr. Azatian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, and thank you very much, colleagues, for inviting us to this important discussion. And as Sabine has mentioned, it's indeed a global development, and it's really great to see that the region in America is providing such an important contribution through this report. And again, would like to thank Celeste for her exceptional dedication to this area. And I just would like to mention also that we had some discussions about certification scheme and its impact on regulation of medical products in a number of our international conferences of drug regulatory authorities, and Celeste was always in the front line of this area, promoting and defending and trying to find a way together with all colleagues on how we can in fact improve the scheme for it to serve its purpose. Because as Sabine has mentioned, it is existing now for more than 50 years. It has been developed and proposed at the time when the most sophisticated communication device was a teletype or fax machine. And of course, it was at that time was considered as a revolutionary instrument that over the time it gradually changed its value in terms of implementation, because the technologies were developing, the regulatory science was developing, and of course there were always some other instruments and mechanisms becoming available for the countries to inform their national regulatory decision. But certification scheme was there in use, and still it is in use. And I can tell you that there are new members already joining, and the requests to join the scheme are still coming to WHO. It means that countries still value this scheme and they want to have it implemented properly. Of course, this report had a very important impact on how the scheme will be implemented, and it's good that it was going developed in parallel with our development at the global level, with all these discussions that Dr. Pope has mentioned about. But I'm really happy to see that the outcomes of this report are quite coherent with what we have been also identifying and defining during our discussions at the global level. And this is that the scheme is valuable. It is still an important instrument. It should be used because it is in the legal requirement of still quite a number of countries, and not only in the region of Americas, but in all other regions of WHO. But everybody understands that scheme need to be improved for it to be able to respond to the most recent developments in science, in technology, in communication. Also, the regulatory landscape has changed. There is more understanding of how trust is important, how regulatory collaboration, convergence, and work sharing are important, and this report is absolutely contributing in this perception, in this direction. I would also maybe just like to address a couple of issues which were highlighted in the report, and this is again some countries hesitation, I would say, or maybe they are still not ready to switch to electronic ways of issuing certificates, while this COVID-19 pandemic, which we are in the middle of, has demonstrated that in fact many of the approaches which looked quite important but almost unrealistic for us, suddenly overnight they became realistic. Even for us in WHO, all these electronic document turnover become a reality overnight with COVID-19 pandemic. So the same is with the certification scheme. Immediately as COVID pandemic has started, we started to receive requests from some of the regulatory authorities to consider this electronic option of certificates and issuance of certificates through secure web platforms and other means of more modern issuance of this document, which is the future. And in fact, the discussions in Geneva has demonstrated that this is the future, and sooner or later we have to be able to shift to this new ways of working. What is also important that the report has mentioned that many countries, even those who are happy to switch to electronic certificates, they still require legalization or notarial confirmation of these certificates in the issuing country. And this is another impediment which in fact decreases the whole value of electronic certificate. What we have already some examples of how the report could be issued with the electronic signature, which is now widely accepted as a legal mean of verification of authenticity of the document. So perhaps we would also need to have some discussions and to further promote this scheme to become more modern in terms of also accepting electronic signatures. And lastly, also Sabine has mentioned about link between the certification scheme and reliance, which is very obvious. And it is also symbolic that in October this year, the expert committee for specification of pharmaceutical products, together with this area, together with the revised certification scheme, two important documents were adopted, and one is on good regulatory practices and another one is on good reliance practices. And good reliance practices document was based on the initial drafts and concept proposed also by Pan American Health Organization and PANDRH. So again, a very close link, and we would like to thank our colleagues in American region for their valuable input and contribution and initiation of these discussions. So I think we should be trying to make this link stronger and to promote reliance as an overarching principle for regulators to collaborate and to use information available from other sources for their national decision making as much as it is possible. And I strongly believe that certification scheme still remains an important instrument that fits into this perception, into this concept, and we have to do our best to start implementing it once the revised scheme becomes available early next year. With this, again, I would like to thank organizers for this important discussion and for inviting WHO headquarters to come with contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azatian, for your pertinent comments. I would like to invite now Dr. Liberty to have your comments on the report and how you see the relevance of the CPP in the context of regulatory efficiencies. Dr. Liberty, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Juan Carlos. I do want to thank the organizers, Camille, Celeste, and others who have put this really informative session together. I'm honored to be on this panel with my colleagues, and in thinking about the report, it came to light to me that there were three aspects of how the findings of this report are actually supportive of regulatory efficiencies. And the three areas are in how the CPP can help reduce lag time, in other words, the time from when a product is first approved in a stringent regulatory authority to when it gets submitted to another agency, how it can reduce overall approval time, and how CPP flexibility can contribute to these areas. So I'd just like to touch on those very briefly, and then we can go into perhaps a little bit more depth during the Q&A. What I'm going to do is refer to a recently published article that my colleagues and I published in Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science just in June. This is research driven by my colleague Céline Rodier and was supported by Magda Bujar and Neil McCausland, who many of you know, and Prisha Patel. And what we did was we looked at how the CPP is actually being used. So much like you did, we did a bit of a landscaping of 18 agencies around the world. We also did a survey, and I'm not going to go into the survey results of industry, except in one brief area, but the comprehensive report is available online through Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science, and it might be available on our website too. So when it comes to the first bit about reducing approval time, it's interesting. What we found was when we looked at 16 authorities, now these were all around the world, and a number of them were in Latin America, that the majority of them, about 65% of them, indicated that the CPP should be provided at the time of submission. Now we've already heard about regulatory flexibility within this, And but what we found is that in a number of countries, as you know, including Brazil and even Colombia, the CPP could be submitted after this submission, but prior to obtaining the regulatory approval. So that kind of an activity can help reduce the lag time, how long it takes to actually prepare the submission and get the submission to the next country. In addition to reducing the lag time, we found that it does reduce the overall approval times. And what we found is that when the CPP was submitted after the marketing authorization, the overall timeline from the first approval in the world, the first approval to the emerging market approval was shorter actually for 11 of 12 authorities. So that's okay. You know, we know that that's important, that having the CPP can shorten the approval time. But even more importantly, we found across the 12 authorities that the overall median time from first in world approval to the emerging market approval was 477 days when the CPP was submitted after the marketing authorization. So in other words, having some flexibility there, as opposed to 965 days where the CPP had to be submitted at the time of the marketing authorization. So big difference in having that flexibility built into it. So we know that a large driver of that was in fact the shortening of the lag time. I think another interesting finding from our data that supports this concept of regulatory efficiency is when we got data from 11 multinational companies about their new molecular entity submissions over the last couple of years, we found that a little bit more than half of the new active substances, it was about 12 of 22, approved in Brazil, now specifically around Brazil, actually didn't require the CPP, even though there was information that suggested that the CPP was required. This is really a good sign in the sense that CPPs can be an element of negotiation. There will be times when, for a variety of reasons, it's important to have the data package available and to move quickly on the data package. And rather than hold up the decision, waiting for a CPP, a decision can be made in the absence of the CPP. So the three areas, again, that I want to come back to are that in terms of regulatory efficiency, that the CPP reduces approval time, it can reduce new molecular entity lag time, and it can serve as the basis for what may be called regulatory flexibility. So I think it goes back to the point that Celeste made, that there are differences in the way that CPPs are accepted, the legalization component, the specific requirements. But if we can move towards an alignment of these requirements, we can optimize regulatory efficiency, especially as Samvel just mentioned, to support good reliance practices, which are becoming so important as we move forward. So I think adhering to what might become the best practices for using CPPs will actually be one of the most important aspects of bringing regulatory efficiencies to an optimized place by using the CPP. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to my colleagues. Thanks.
Dr. Liberty, thank you very much for your comments. I would like to invite now Dr. Rebecca Lumsden to bring the industry view on the potential impact of the results of the report that we just heard for the region, and also to share a little bit of the industry expectations when it comes to modernizing the practices and the use of CPP by regulators. So Dr. Lumsden, please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. And I would also like to thank all of the parties who've been involved in the development of this report, and also the workshop and webinar today. PHI is committed to activities that strengthen the regulatory systems in the region, and joint projects such as this one are really critical in supporting the improved public health outcomes by really ensuring that medicinal products and technologies are assessed and approved in that timely and robust manner throughout the whole of their life cycle to benefit patients in the region. One key impact of this project that we've immediately seen is really the demonstration of the value that collaboration can bring in supporting the goals of PANDRH. This collaborative project, where industry and the regulatory authorities have worked together, ultimately led to a collaboration of 24 national regulatory authorities with 10 participating representatives on behalf of industry and one overarching regulatory system. And what that led to was a really robust development of an evidence base representing 27 countries in the region. So an immediate impact for us is that we hope that this is the start of future collaborative efforts from all parties to improve regulatory convergence and strengthen regulatory capacities of countries in the region. But back to the report itself, I think what we can see is that the role of the CPP in regulatory processes across the region is very well established. But this report will allow us to identify opportunities to update these regulatory systems to lead to a more timely access to medicines and ultimately a more unified approach to CPP-related requirements. While the role and importance of CPP must not be understated, and I think we've heard comments from Dr. Kopp and Dr. Atjivan and Dr. Liberti telling us and explaining why the CPP is so important, we do need to ensure that its use is optimized and modernized across the region. And what do I mean by modernization? Well, I think one key opportunity, and some of my other panelists have already mentioned it, is the use and acceptance of electronic CPP. Now, the use of eCPP throughout the COVID pandemic and actually at the current time has really demonstrated the value that it can bring in securing regulatory business continuity and ultimately allowing regulatory agencies to continue to function and fulfill their duties, which ultimately will benefit access to medicines for patients on the ground. We need to recognise that electronic CPP is a tool that all stakeholders can use and that it can play a role at all of the stages of a product life cycle where currently a CPP is required. What we would hope to see is that electronic CPPs ultimately will be fully integrated within some of the other emerging digital systems that we're seeing arriving across the region, again, partly driven at a faster rate due to the COVID pandemic. And this means that electronic CPPs will go hand in hand with acceptance of electronic signatures, electronic dossier submissions, and other emerging digital systems. But we do also recognise from an industry perspective that there needs to be appropriate security standards for electronic signatures and for these eCPP documents to ensure that the authenticity of these digital documents will be captured and accepted. We really welcomed the EMA's activity in this space where they're allowing regulatory agencies to actually contact them directly and confirm the authenticity of their eCPPs. But this also goes together with some of the comments that Dr. Kopp made, that it's important that legalization of the electronic CPP may not actually be required, and additional apostilling of these documents may not be necessary if the right security systems can be put in place. Finally, I think the third impact that we see from an industry perspective is the role that CPP can play in supporting reliance activities in the region, and ultimately expediting access to innovative and generic medicines alike. And we really look forward to working with the other regional stakeholders to expand the discussions of these results and identify the best practices to be taken forward. As Dr. Sanchez stated in her opening remarks, we really want to ensure that this report will provide an evidence base to ultimately change policies relating to the use of CPP across the region. And on behalf of industry, we're very keen to continue that dialogue in a collaborative fashion. I think that was the main thrust of my remarks. So I'd be very welcome to start the question and answer.
Thank you, Dr. Lumsden, for your comments. Highly appreciated as always. We will now begin the Q&A session with the audience. So for that purpose, I will ask Camila Gomez, our presenter, to take the floor and make the questions to the members of the panel. Camila, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. First of all, I would like to invite the members of the panel to turn on their cameras. And I would also like to invite the participants to add their names, their questions to the Q&A option. Let's start with a question to Celeste. Celeste, I'll make this question in Spanish, as it was originally in Spanish. ¿Por qué el concepto de país de origen no tiene la importancia?
Why does the concept of country of origin not have the same importance? Can you please comment on this, Celeste, about the findings of this report regarding the country of origin? Yes, of course. The issue is not the importance, it is the country of origin has an importance, but it has been modified and it has been transformed through time in the concept of the country of origin. On the same token as the pharmaceutical industry is globalized, the country of origin of fabrication of the product, the full product, stopped existing. The manufacturing is done through many links in the productive chain, and not just in the productive chain at the time of manufacturing of the pharmaceutical product, but also the ingredients, the active ingredients of the different materials. So that's a consequence, direct consequence of the globalization of the pharmaceuticals. And the market has also been globalized in such a way that in a country, not only will it be exported, but the product is fabricated in the country. And there are certain mechanisms whereby you can have a product in this country where the packaging has occurred. So the importance is maintained.
Más complejo debido a la globalización, identificar como una figura única en el
So here we have this concept of the country of origin, because we have these countries that are intervening, and it's not possible to leave outside the focus of all those who have to do with the impact of the.
Thank you, Celeste. Our next question goes to Samuel, maybe. How can we leverage the CPP to expedite regulatory reviews and approvals in the region and avoid duplication of work? And maybe Dr. Liberty or Mario can also comment on that later on.
Thank you, Camila. I think this is perhaps the most important question about CPP, because there is a lot of perception that maybe this is an outdated approach, why we are still using CPP when there is an internet, when there is an international telephone connection, we can pick up the phone and call and ask, or many other options. But again, we have to be accepting the fact that CPP is still in the requirements of many of our member states. It's not going to be withdrawn from these requirements very soon, not tomorrow, because countries are still, and you have to accept the fact that most of WHO member states have small or very small regulatory authority with very limited resources. And CPP has already been there to prove its ability and importance to provide necessary information about the quality of the products that countries are importing in their territories. And we have to, I think perhaps of a transition process that maybe in some time from now in the future, there will be a different situation. The whole concept of reliance will be more widely accepted and implemented. I can tell you, again, there are some anecdotic situations in some of the countries which are very actively using CPP. They have provisions in their regulations not allowing reliance as a concept as such. So what you can do with these countries, if they do not have a reliance in the process as an option, then CPP is the only way for them to ensure that the products are coming and they are of good quality. Of course, it's a different discussion that we may need to modernize it, at least if we are using CPP, at least to do it in a pragmatic way, not to keep it as an impediment, but rather to have it as something that would improve the communication and will increase the perception of the product as product of good quality by the recipient countries. I don't see duplication. I see rather maybe parallel in time. One will be maybe decreasing in use, other options will be increasing, but this will take time, and we are still in the middle of this continuum where we absolutely need both. Thank you.
Larry or Mario, do you want to
Camila, I'll
complement?
turn it to Mario for 2 minutes, and then I can just add 1 or 2 thoughts.
Okay, that's fine.
Gracias, Larry. Muchas gracias. Bueno, muy brevemente quiero...
Thank you, Larry. Very briefly, I want to congratulate Sekhmet and Celeste, whom I had to work with when the study began.
Organizadores, yo creo que efectivamente...
And effectively, this is a great study, and in a way, this is an action plan.
¿Dónde hay que caminar? Porque identifica muy
to see where we have to walk, because it clearly identifies differences between some countries and others. And these differences, we have other studies where they could be clearly identified, which contribute more to efficiency. So we won't talk about the CPP or CPP, but we're going to talk about harmonization. And we're going to talk about whether it's electronic or not, or delivered at the beginning of the request or flexibly. So that study gives us the realm of all the countries and the possibility to have aspects to contribute to this process. Thank you.
So if I may follow up to these observations, we have 2 questions, and maybe I'll ask Rebecca to take them. Both of them ask what are the next steps of the project now that we've reached this very important milestone of launching the report. What are we going to do next? Rebecca?
Thank you. Thank you, Camila. Well, I'm pleased to say that we do have some next steps already outlined and endorsed by PANDRH Steering Committee. So the first next step will be continuing to work with the other regional stakeholders to prepare a draft document which will expand the discussion of results in the report and also seek to identify these alternatives or best practices for the use of CPP in the Americas. And obviously we would seek to do that in line with the WHO revised scheme that was mentioned by our other panelists. That document would then be taken to stakeholder consultation with other PANDRH members, and ultimately a final documentation would be taken to the PANDRH Steering Committee for hopefully adoption as a recommendation in the next PANDRH conference. So it's really positive that we have this very clear action plan and timeline for our next steps to take this forward.
That's awesome. So as a follow-up, maybe as it is already expected that our next steps on the project regionally depend on some international publications, maybe Dr. Sabine can comment on when would we expect the publication of the scheme and the revised scheme and the new model for the WHO format of the CPP.
Thank you. Yes, of course. I'm sure you're curious to know. We are currently in the editing process, which is in line with the official procedures, the way we have to follow up after the expert committee meeting. And we sincerely hope that the whole report, including the scheme, the new scheme, will be available early next year. I cannot tell you exactly the date, but I would hope that February, March, we can have something out. But it depends not only on our efforts, but on quite a number of other clearances, etc. But I sincerely hope by March we will have the report out together with the annex.
Thank you, fingers crossed. And we have a couple of questions here on a matter that every single panelist touched on. So maybe I'll ask Celeste to take this question, which is the fact that the CPP needs to go over legalization or apostille. How do we see this as a requirement that will be eliminated in the future? Celeste, could you please comment on that topic?
Sí, cómo no, con mucho gusto.
Yes, of course. This element of legalization is one of the most complicated issues and the challenges that we face, because unfortunately they are established by law in many of our countries. So I think that we're not going to quickly solve this problem, but this is going to be one of the elements that we have to focus on. This is going to be favored by the set of aspects that we advance on, and this is going to be impacted for many angles, because I repeat, it is not easy, and there's countries that don't have it by law. So this is going to be advancing, and this is all part of a strategy, a joint strategy that is not just focused on the legalization, but also, as many said, the authorities need to show the process and that it can be shortened. And we need to trace a very precise strategy, because this is an element that can be more difficult to modify. Thank you very much, Celeste. We are almost on time. We're going to take the following questions to be able to send them to you with our answers. There are two anonymous questions, so it's going to be hard to send back an answer to them, but we will try to direct these answers somehow. I'd like to thank the members of our star panel of participants and speakers, the participation of over 120 people we had this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for your interest, your participation, and your questions. And we will be sending by mail, after preparing all the participants that were registered, all the documentation and the version in English and Spanish of the report, also the presentation today, and the article mentioned by Dr. Liberty in his comments. So thank you all, and all of you have a good afternoon and a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for all. Thank you, Camila, for your great leadership, and Celeste as well. This is an excellent result, and we're happy to share it. A great weekend and happy holidays to all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Muchas gracias. Chao.
Gracias, Celeste.
Gracias, hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.
A todos. Chao, hasta luego. Chao, chao.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye bye.
Está muy bien, muy bien. Nos quedó muy bien, creo que sí. Y salir de la reunión.
Camila, thank you so much. Gracias, Mariale, y a todos.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Una pregunta, ¿pueden capturar por favor las preguntas no contestadas que están en el chat para que podamos responder?
Claro.
¿Sí?
Mariale, ¿nos puedes ayudar con eso?
Todo eso queda grabado, no te preocupes.
Pero hay
Ok, perfecto.
un chat, Mariale, que de pronto tómale imagen de pantalla porque ese no queda grabado. Y ahí están todas las preguntas, que son 7 comentarios nomás.
Sí, las preguntas, sí, en el chat solo hay agradecimientos, pero en el box de questions and answers sí hay algunas preguntas que no pudieron ser
En el box.
contestadas.
Ya,
Sí,
listo.
de
Súper.
questions and answers, en el caso.
Vale. A ver, tomamos preguntas con ella.
Listo. Camila, excelente.
Muchas gracias a todos entonces. Buenas tardes y hasta pronto.
Bye.